checking your body and your nuts every night to make sure that there weren't too many leeches attached and burning them off with the lighted end of cigarettes.
Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
The single greatest sacrifice I've made is my family.
We weren't out there to take country. We were out there to do something. That was our job.
I did feel a lot of regret.
Friends were still getting killed.
It got to the point where, you're going to funerals quite often.
Do I lead under fire?
And that was a heavy responsibility, I guess, on my shoulders that I didn't want to screw up.
To be resilient to be able to cope
War
with
itself
any
is horrific. It's a horror story. It should never be dressed up as if it's something glorious.
Not what you can do for yourself, but what can you do for your country.
The volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
Tony Dell is a veteran of the Vietnam War. The national serviceman is also the only Test cricketer to fight in Vietnam. He was a fast medium-seam bowler who made his Test debut against England for the vital 7th Test in the 1970-71 Ashes series, taking 5 wickets in that match. After war, sport gave Tony an outlet and place of mateship and camaraderie, but he could not escape that the war had scarred him. This trauma ultimately gave him a life-changing mission: stand tall for PTS. Tony spoke to Thomas Kaye about his military career and life after service, including the book recently written about him by Greg Milam, and Bring the Darkness Home, the Tony Dell Story.
I'm Thomas Kaye, and today I'm speaking with Tony Dell over Zoom. Tony, welcome to Life on the Line.
Thank you very much.
So, Tony, let's start at the very beginning. Tell us about your upbringing.
I always delight in saying I was born a POM, born in the south of England on the day that the Americans dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. My dad was in the Royal Navy. He was much embroiled in World War II, and it was a while before he came out of the Navy, and he then worked for Hoover as a travelling salesperson, and I guess I didn't see a lot of him. My mum I was the first of 4, so she did a lot of work in bringing us up, mostly by herself, and we lived in a military prefab in a little place called Highcliffe, just near Bournemouth, Southampton way. And I guess I don't remember a lot about that. I mean, it was a fairly stressful time, I guess, in the very early years. But, as time progressed, being a young kid in the idyllic English countryside was great. Dad moved up the chain in Hoover, and by 1957, I think, he was the manager of Hoover in South Wales, and we lived in Cardiff. And we were there for the they were called the Empire Games back then in 1958. It was my first real close encounter, with Australians, because I was a Boy Scout and I was tied up in delivering messages here, there, and everywhere. But my first memories of Australians and cricket was actually the 1956 Ashes in England. It was. I guess that sort of started me off on being some sort of a cricketer. I mean, I was always considered myself in my early days as a wicketkeeper batsman. One day in 1959, my dad got the family together and said, "How would you like to move to Australia?" Sounded very exciting. I was put into Church of England Grammar School in Brisbane in late 59. I left school. I wanted to be an architect, but I couldn't get into an architect's office. 2 or 3 months later, I then got into advertising. By then it was, 1965. The war in Vietnam was escalating. Australia didn't have enough regular troops to satisfy the demands, so they brought on national service. For everyone that turned 20 in 1965 was eligible, but your birthday had to be pulled out of the hat. So the 6th of August, 1945, was bad luck for the Japanese, and it was very bad luck for Tony Dell. So 1966, 67, I learned to be a soldier down at Singleton, and then got transferred to 2RAR in Brisbane. My main reason for coming back to Brisbane was that I wanted to resume my cricket on weekends. But then 2RAR were next in line to go to Vietnam. So I spent most of my time, on exercises and didn't play all that much cricket. 1967, 68, I became a real soldier.
So with your number coming up in the National Service Lottery, had you ever previously thought of joining the military?
None whatsoever. My dad was aghast and he said, "Oh, no, we've got to try and get you out of this. Let's go in there for a medical and tell them you've got flat feet." That didn't work. I then was accepted and went off to Singleton for six months. 3 months was recruit training and 3 months was core training.
How did you find all the training?
I loved it. I look back now and think about my time and Vietnam and the mates regime of military. And, I often think that, hey, if it wasn't for cricket, after my 2 years, I could quite possibly have signed up.
Do you think that your sporting past in that point with all the cricket had helped prepare you for the military?
Yes. I played, in those days, you played cricket in the summer and rugby in the winter. Sport was a 52-week sort of situation for me. I was a team man. I never, ever excelled at any individual sport.
So jumping back to following your training and Vietnam kicking off, did you have any ideas of what you're in for before you had boots on the ground?
You were 21, you were bloody physically fit. You're with a whole raft of mates, because, the camaraderie within the military is second to none. And I was young, I was full of testosterone and boys' own stuff, every boy's dream. But, you were going off to be a soldier and fighting a war. I have no qualms. I loved every bit of it. And during the training at the Jungle Training Centre at Penungra, I did something silly, bloody fell down a fairly long cliff edge with all my gear and rifle and et cetera, got a green stick fracture of my leg, I chuffed off to hospital. And a few weeks before we were due to leave, I got called up to the CO's office, was told that because you're a national serviceman, and you didn't complete the jungle training, the law says you don't have to go. In a heartbeat, I said, "No, I'm right. I'm going." You'd done all that training. Why would you waste it? Plus, what was I going to do? Sit back in Australia and just do parades and possibly bloody field spuds, et cetera. So, there was no thought about going.
Can you tell us about your arrival into Vietnam and what happened just not long after?
We caught the HMAS Sydney in Brisbane and spent, about 10 days sleeping in hammocks, which was fairly awkward for a big bugger like me. And up on deck, every day, PT training, live shooting off the side of the boat into targets in the water. Got to Bung Tau, chop it off by Chinooks, and straight into Nui Dat, and shown where our lines were, unpacked, and here we were. I think the first week or so, we just got acclimatized, just continued, just being told what was expected of us and what we were doing. And, this was very much part of the exercises we used to have at home, except it's different territory and slightly warmer and a lot wetter. So I think we did, sort of a 1-day search and destroy, then a 2-day one, and then a 3-day one, and then gradually got into the groove and became very much part of the whole battalion and task force strategy.
Did you enjoy all of that?
Yes, most definitely. There were times where I guess it got arduous. I spent a lot of my time in company headquarters with OC of Charlie Company, 2RAR, a fellow called Major Jim Monteith, who was one of my heroes. He was just such an incredible person. Spending lots of time in the jungle, in the paddy fields and water and foliage and checking your body and your nuts every night to make sure that there weren't too many leeches attached and burning them off with the lighted end of cigarettes. It was just surreal, when I think back.
Is there any stories that you can share?
There were situations where, you saw stuff and one of the things with PTSD is that it's just the brain experiencing something that it wasn't manufactured for. And one particular incident sticks out in my mind in that we were out during the Tet Offensive. I think it was actually Australia Day 1968. And our 9 platoon was out patrolling. They encountered some enemy. They followed them. And all of a sudden, they'd walked into a BC camp. They were trapped. The messages came through from the platoon commander to the company commander, and he just took the rest of the company into that VC camp, and the whole company was trapped. There were snipers all around. That was late afternoon, and we just spent the night sort of hunkered down, with the odd bullet whizzing over our heads. The company commander at that stage, went to water. The CSM took charge. And just deployed everyone as best they could in the dark. I guess we sort of spent the night shitting ourselves and wondering, what was going to happen and how are we going to get out of this. And then come daylight, we called in the gunships and artillery, and just cleared the whole perimeter, and we were able to sort of get out. And one of the things that I sort of remember quite vividly is, sort of NVC bodies, with heads blown out. Not a pretty sight. So, that was one particular incident which I think possibly resonated with me. But, the thing with those sorts of things and PTSD is that you've got a job to do. You just compartmentalise, the crap and move on, because you can't shirk or nick off or go and have a rest or sit down with a psych, which really didn't exist in those days anyway. And I guess there was another incident when before I came home, because my time was up, so I had to leave the battalion, the company, and come home a bit earlier. And we were put into a holding company, and that holding company for a week or so was in charge of ambush patrols. We'd go out and get to an ambush spot and sit there and wait for whatever came along. The corporal in charge of the ambush patrol got lost. Came dusk, we had to stand to. That came and went. By then it was pitch dark. He was routed because he had no idea where we were and no idea where we had to be. We just kept going for a while, and then the whole idea was we could set up an ambush. We didn't know where we were. So he just told us to just sit quietly in the bush, in the long grass, and wait till morning. And then lo and behold, a big contingent of VC approached and walked right through, the whole ambush group. No one knew where anyone was, so we couldn't fire, we couldn't do anything. And if we had, we would have got slaughtered. At that stage, I had the radio, and I had to turn it off because it would give us away. They moved through. We decided that we need to call in artillery to blast them. To be quite frank, I was so shit scared I couldn't talk on the radio. And someone else, sort of took over until I regained my composure, and we called in artillery and bombarded where we thought they'd gone. And again, you compartmentalise in abject fear of your life, and there was nothing that you could have done about it. And a few days later, I'd gone to Tan Son Nhut Airport, gone to Hong Kong on a military plane, and then caught a domestic flight, international flight from Hong Kong to Sydney, where my family met me. And I stayed there for about a week in Sydney because I had to get back up to Enoggera to be let go. And just as an aside, I'd been totally in love before I left. This girl wrote to me continually, and I wrote back. I had 4 days R&R in Hong Kong, so I bought her an engagement ring. She was at the airport when I came home, and the next day we met up, and I gave her the ring. And then the day after, she gave it back and said, "I've met someone else." The ultimate Dear John. And I thought, well, stuff this, I'm going to get out of Sydney. So I borrowed my mum's car, drove up to Sydney, and welcome back to Queensland, because as soon as I got over the border, I got a speeding ticket, got discharged and got my final pay, a handshake, and fucking see you later. 2 and a bit weeks after I came home, a bit over 3 weeks after that ambush, I was walking up and down Queen Street, not game to tell anyone where I'd been, because we were always warned, don't wear your uniform in public because of all the protests, and it's just as likely somebody long-haired, bearded, bloody uni student would spit on you. So, yeah, I mean, probably out of the whole 2 years, those 2 or 3 weeks were possibly the most traumatic. For the next couple of years, and I always say this now, that in the absence of any psychological therapy for my PTSD, mental trauma, just the camaraderie of team sport, training, playing cricket, playing rugby, dressing room banter, and the workaholic aspect of my job, and the fact that I loved it, just kept me busy for 365 days of the year. So late 1968, I was picked in the Queensland Colts, thinking, oh shit, I'm a shoo-in here for the Queensland team, but not to be. I mean, I didn't get picked for Queensland until 1970.
Did you ever think that when you came back at first that cricket was going to be what it was?
No, not really. I mean, there was never any design about anything that's ever happened in my life. I came to Australia because of my dad. I played club cricket because I was pretty good at it and I enjoyed it. I never had any great designs to play for Queensland. I had no idea that I would ever get selected to play for Australia. So, I mean, just every single thing that's ever happened is I just happen to be the right person in the right time at the right place. I just do what I do because it seems to be the right thing.
We'll move now to what's a tough topic for a lot of veterans. It wasn't until 40 years after coming back from Vietnam that you got diagnosed with PTSD. Can you tell us what led to that diagnosis?
I played 4 years of first-class cricket. I played a couple of test matches. And then I was 12th man at a test match in Sydney in 1973-74 season. I now know, in talking to psychiatrists and psychologists, that I always had guilt complex. I was nicking off and playing cricket, leaving people to do my job back at work. That was my main income. Cricket was just something that I loved doing. Then in 1980, I got fired. In hindsight, it was for PTSD reasons. I'd been giving sort of young workers who weren't measuring up a hard time because of that, syndrome of teamwork, et cetera, That sort of thing works in the army, but it doesn't work in business. And I got fired. And shit, I'd given up my cricket for them. The 80s was an absolute roller coaster. I had 3 children, one in 81, one in 84, one in 86, 2 girls and a boy. By the end of 1990, I'd lost my house, I'd lost my business premises, and we were on the bones of our arse. I don't remember much about the 90s. They're more or less a blur. How I got through it, I don't know. I know that one of my saviours was coaching my son's cricket teams, and I'm still incredible mates with all of those kids. In 2007, I got a call from Defence Cricket, retired colonels involved in Defence Cricket, saying every 2 years we have this International Defence Cricket Challenge, and because you're the only Vietnam veteran that played Test cricket, we'd like you to be our guest. So that was fine. So that was in Canberra and the final was at Manuka Oval. Just before I was about to come home, they said, oh, have you still got your medals? And I said, oh, no. Being sort of regular ex-colonels, they said, oh, you got 4, but there's a 5th. I said, I've got no idea about that. They said, well, you've got to get replacement. And I said, really? Because I'd never, ever marched. So I went into drop-ins, Vietnam Veterans Drop-In Centre in Cotton Tree, Maroochydore, because I was living on the Sunshine Coast at that time. And there was a number of veterans there and Vietnam veterans. All they wanted to do was talk about cricket. So I spent half an hour talking about, the state of Sheffield and Test match cricket and da-di-da-di-da. And then after about half an hour, they said, you've got PTSD. I said, oh, cool. And they said, yes, definitely. And they asked me a few more pertinent questions about symptoms. I gave them all the right answers. And eventually I was properly diagnosed, got the gold card and the pension.
2010, you founded Stand Tall for PTS. How does it help the veterans?
The reason for it, the fact that within the military and the Veteran Association, PTSD was taboo, and the effect it had on people was a mystery. And I think within the military at that stage, it was considered a bit of a cop-out. And I knew from my experience and talking to fellow Vietnam veterans, gone through the same journey as I, and they had no idea what's in the brain will stay in the brain. And if we repair the brain, then we could cure PTSD. But there are all these ways and means of managing it. With all my research, I was not qualified to help people, but I could certainly make the authorities and the rest of Australia aware of what it was to help to reduce the stigma and say that, it's an illness, it is not a weakness. And so many military coppers, fireys, ambos will not own up because of fear of it denting their aspirations. It's this drive, this reason for being, reason for living.
The Zoom connection got a little patchy here, but after describing Stand Tall for PTS as a huge driving force and new purpose in his life, Tony directed listeners to the website to learn more. That website is standtallforpts.org, where 4 is a numeral. Back to their conversation.
Very, very slow start. Had to spend a lot of my own money to keep it going. But Angus Houston by then, was retired. Him being my patron gave me some credibility. I then met Catherine McGregor. We became the charity attached to the Prime Minister's cricket match at Manuka Oval in Canberra in early 2015. And then in 2016, we had to look at creating more awareness. So we came up with a concept of a lightning bolt convoy, because our logo is a lightning bolt. Put together a convoy of military and first responder vehicles and personnel. And we travelled from Brisbane down the Pacific Highway to Sydney, across to Goulburn and Canberra, and then down to Melbourne, stopping along the way over 11 days, doing lots of talking to people, going into RSLs and doing a major press conference with Angus Campbell in Canberra. We had with us a big semi-trailer given to us by Lynn Fox, a moving billboard, and we were due to give a massive conference, all the media in Melbourne at the Lindsay Fox Car Museum in Melbourne. And all the media were there. We were about half an hour out, and Brexit happened.
Timing.
Yeah. So we then just did something at Federation Square, split up, and everyone went their way.
So Stand Tall for PTS isn't only for defence. It's
well, it's grown. Yeah. It started out as Vietnam Vet, and then other veteran organisations said, well, what about Iraq and Afghanistan and Timor, etc. So it grew. We talk about victims of crime, accidents and natural disasters. And when we look at the suicides of rural areas are double that of the Australian average. It's very, very hard. Have you talked to Heston Russell at all?
Yes,
Well, Heston and I have now talking a lot together. And he loves my story, and he loves the fact that, you've got a 76-year-old bloody Vietnam veteran and this 35-year-old Afghanistan veteran, and we've got the same goals. We want to work together.
Out now is your book, Bring the Darkness Home, the Tony Dell Story.
I mean, the book is as much about war, PTSD, and the ramifications as it is about me.
In just a few words, if there was something you could say to anyone that was in your shoes or post-service, what would be your advice to them?
Open up and start talking. It's an illness. It is not a weakness.
Tony, it has been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for your service, your work in the community, and for sharing your story with us today.
Not a problem. Thank you.
I'm Thomas Kaye, and you've been listening to Life on the Line.
That was Thomas Kaye's conversation with Tony Dell. We spoke with former commando Heston Russell at the start of this season. Don't miss that video podcast, number 102, Heston Russell.
Watching the guys go out there and do that so often without ever fearing for their own lives, not in any form of cowboy heroism, but just for the fact that we had a job to do. We trusted each other so much, and we were more fearful of letting each other down and failing the mission than we were of our own lives.
You can find a variety of Vietnam War stories on our website by going to the episodes page. And don't forget your copy of And Bring the Darkness Home for yourself or a Christmas present. Follow us at Life on the Line Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, at LOTL Pod on Twitter, and at Thistle Productions on LinkedIn. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget,